not going to stop the genocide. The answer must come from all the Palestinian Arab neighbours whose peace talking over the last 8 months has led to nothing. It's time for them to mobilise a military response and send armed support and armies to Palestine to drive the fascist Israelis out from Gaza and out of the territory in 1967. It's appropriate that I'm speaking here today in Sheffield, the city where 40 years ago I addressed a crowd just a few hundred yards away, outside St James's House, following the National Executive Committee unanimously for the face of the sun there here, that means everybody. They sanctioned the NUM areas to take strike action against pit closures in accordance with the union's rule, National Rule 41. In marking the 40th anniversary of the miners' strike, I want to pay tribute to all the miners and their families who in 1984 and 5 fought the greatest workers' fight since the days of the Merthyr Rising, the Tolpuddle Martyrs, the Newport Chartists, the Featherstone Martyrs, yes, the suffragettes. It's an honour, and always has been, to have young miners fighting for the future, and the magnificent women against pit closures who are here. From the start of that strike on the 12th of March 1984, I believe that the target was the steel plants. Why? Because they knew why. Had been passed information from the highest level. They only had 3 weeks to supply. And for reasons I don't know why, even the National Executive Committee believed that the real targets were the power stations and pickets into the areas like Nottingham and South Derbyshire who had not taken a decision to strike. But from the start, it was obvious that that was the change. In May, we began picketing on 22nd of March. It was obvious to me then that the police in numbers were already present. And the first day I was there, on the 23rd of May, I got knocked over a fence, by accident of course. By the time we reached the 30th of May, I was arrested. The charge, I wanted to go to the spot we were in from the 22nd of May. I was being denied the right, and all the pickets who were with me, to take picketing duties in accordance with the United Nations Charter and the conventions of the International Labour Organization. That strike was legal because it was an area strike. There were judges in the High Court consistently referring to the failure to have a ballot before the national strike. They knew bloody well it was an area, a strike. They knew well that the rules of the union gave us permission, and yet they chose to ignore it. The union set up a national coordinating committee. We approached the deputies union, NACOS. They didn't want to know, but they said, we will picket our men there is no hope they will not be going into work. And they did that. We met with Bill Sears of the Steel Union, who in 1980 we had taken hundreds of miners in Sheffield and closed the steel plant. We said reciprocate. Give us support. We don't want resolutions. Pull your members out on strike. When we took our members down, we closed the plant. And Bill Sears, 2 hours later, gave an instruction to reopen it. That's called sabotage and treachery by trade union leaders. Having been arrested, I knew what the problems were. I knew what the strength was. I'll tell you how I knew. It wasn't something magic in my head. George Moores, a member of the South Yorkshire County Council, responsible for major incidents, passed to me a document sent down from central government telling them how many police were drafted in to South Yorkshire, and in particular to deal with the area in and or around Orgreave. The number of police, the riot police, were 8,200. That was the figure. When we finally persuaded the NEC to agree that areas who took strike action were doing it in accordance with law and rule, we faced them with 10,000 pickets. But we did so in a planned way. I'm sick and tired of listening to people say we walked into a trap. We didn't. We'd been picketing from the 22nd of May. When we went down on that day, they again stopped us. And again, we knew we were in for a fight. They had horses, dogs, long shields, short shields, truncheons, and the determination like a fascist state would have. They intended to inflict maximum injury wherever they could. The Chief Inspector, who Jonas Pearson referred to, made clear that he exempted what was taking place. He'd been instrumental in coordinating the action. It didn't suddenly come down. It was planned because they knew we were going down. I arranged for walkie-talkies to be handed to 5 people in our union at strategic points. But by the way, they never say anything in the media, but part of our delegation, our strike committee, occupied the plant, the strict pickets from Hatfield, only briefly, but it demonstrated the power that we could exert. The government, of course, were determined to do everything they possibly could to inflict the maximum punishment on the National Union of Mine Workers. I've seen not only government papers before the strike, but also after the strike. And I know that the area that was troubled and worried and frightened that Thatcher and the government was Orgreave, Ravenscraig, Hartlepool, Port Talbot, Van Wern, all power stations, because they burned coke, and the coke came from coking plants, and all over those were picketed. The fundamental difference between the Battle of Saltley in 1972 and 1984 was that in 1972 workers in other industries pulled out their members and they joined the picket line, closed the plant and won the victory. I described it as the greatest day of my life. And the chief constable in Birmingham said, "Would you do me a favour? Would you move the crowd? You've achieved your objective." I said, "Yes." And two purposes. One, you allow me to make a speech. And two, can I order your loudspeaker because mine's knackered? He agreed. And I spoke from the top of a urinal. I was very proud of what had happened. The same thing was happening at Orgreave. And after I was knocked unconscious in that famous day on the 18th of June, yes, I was knocked out as well, put in a hospital bed. I knew what the policy was. It was being achieved. How many people in this crowd realise that the chairman of British Steel said to telex, ordering the closure of Orgreave that night? Nick Jones of the BBC is here today to confirm. He showed me that document, that telex. In other words, we were winning. Dennis Doody, who was a full-time organiser of UCAT, heard it on the radio in Sheffield. In other words, there was every reason to increase and not decrease the picketing on that day. In fact, I urged all the area leaders who had taken strike action, who were there that day on the 18th, that on the 19th they should increase it and pull in people from Sheffield in the engineering works, as we had done in Saltley from the engineering works. There was no reason why not. But Blanche Flannery was in charge of the people in the trade union movement, and had given an undertaking that they would do everything they could. We had other trade unions committing themselves to action, but for some reason I never understood. Picketing was withdrawn at the time when I wasn't there. But in any event, that day will go down in history as one of the greatest fight backs ever seen. The CEGB estimated that there were only got 6 months supply. And of course Thatcher, I don't know why she did it, but in her autobiography she devoted a chapter of 40 pages to me. It's headed Mr. Scargill's Insurrection. I thought it showed me. Secretly, when you read it, it's an interesting read. All those so-called historians who so far have never hit the truth, have a look. She says that Mr. Scargill outwitted us. And then she goes on to say, the problem we've got is at the steel plants and the coking plants. And that is where we have to concentrate, what we have to do. She admitted that they would not be able to withstand any longer than 3 to 5 weeks. That's what she says. And we picketed on an ongoing basis, not only in Orgreave, but in other places as well. In other words, what we were doing was the right thing. Our people were aware of what we were doing. Then we had a negotiating there. We had that clown McGregor with a paper bag over his head. And we had the Deputies Union, NACOT. They took a decision with a ballot of 82% to take strike action. We met them at ACAS, the conciliation body. We were in one room, they were in another, the poll board in another, and of course ACAS officials in another. The idea was to go from one to the other, seeking a solution. We knew for a fact there could only be one solution, and that would be if we could join with our union that had just taken a decision by an 82% ballot to take strike action in the mining industry. So I was delegated to go to the deputies' room. I did. And I put to them a proposal that we had agreed. And I suggested that if they could accept that, we could have a united front. And there's no doubt we would have won. What happened? They accepted. That trade union, the National Association, shop firers, deputies, accepted our script and agreed to come out on strike. All of a sudden, the tables had turned. ACAS officials met us and said, we can see nothing wrong with your proposal. We thought we'd got them. The coal board with McGregor said, I'm off. And they went. And of course, if you read Thatcher's autobiography, what she says is that if this strike takes place, namely the Deputies Union and the NUM, we will have to concede defeat and settle on terms agreed at ACAS. The person who told me was a senior member of the Tory government. Years later, in a situation, following a television program in which I was being interviewed, and he was being interviewed. And he approached me. I'd never seen him before. And he said, Arthur, can I ask you a question? Oh, how is he? He said, why is it that when the under managers took their decision to strike, I said, do you mean the Deputies Trade Union, NACOT? Oh yes, he said, that's the one. He said, why was it that when they took a decision to strike, we, that's the Tory government, understood from the commission by Thatcher, she organised the commission of ministers, and said, if this goes ahead, we have to concede and agree the terms that have been agreed by NACOT and the NUM at that time. 3 days later, I could feel a change in the air. I couldn't get contact with the Deputies' Union. And I told Mick McGahey and Peter Heathfield, my Vice President and General Secretary, that there was something wrong. And there was. What was wrong was that they changed their position. And they decided to accept a negotiated agreement that wasn't binding, that didn't include a decision that no pit would close unless exhausted or on safety grounds. Why, he said, why did they change their mind? Particularly, by the way, another one for the historians, on that day, NACOG's officials, the President and the General Secretary, were persuaded and cajoled by the TUC for the first time in history to take strike action. In other words, go ahead, because that will win. And yet we pulled away, and as a result, we lost that battle. And we're at the position today. I want to ask you, because all those men and women who were blooded at Orgreave have a right to know. And I still plead and demand an explanation. Why didn't they do it? It was sabotage. Shame. It was betrayal.
Shame.
And quite frankly, it's something I'll never understand. I'm privileged that I was a member of the NUM and its president in 1984-5. I'm proud of the fact that so many of our young men and women for the first time took to the streets in support of the miners on strike. They didn't just man or woman soup kitchens, they actually picketed. That's why, for a brief period, they were taken into the membership of the NUM. They were the bravest of the brave. It's a privilege for me to be here 40 years on, telling you that Mick McGahey, Peter Heathfield and Arthur Scargill voted when the decision was taken. We voted to continue the strike, and I'm proud of that. The mining strike of 1984-5 remains an inspiration, not only for workers and today's trade union leaders. They should listen to their responsibility, come together in direct action, as you've heard other speakers say, and challenge government and employers against all forms of injustice, inequality and exploitation. The unemployment figures are high. There isn't 1.2 million unemployed. There's over 10 million unemployed when you count what's described as economic inactive. All of those people are in fact people who can't get money from the government and yet they can't get a job. It's a privilege for me to be here today with all of you that were there on that day. You marched on that day, you fought on that day. The people who were injured on that day did so in a long line, as you heard, of trade unionists throughout history. They themselves, you are talking to, daughters and sons of them as well, marched into history. You entered into the pantheon of working class heroes and heroines. Those two lads who were mowed down in the course of that strike. We owe it to them to say that never again will we allow it to happen. What we told you then, what I told you then, in 1984, was the truth. It took years for people to understand have been described, well, names I can't even remember. By the way, I've either met or heckled every Prime Minister since 1950. But I've never met Thatcher. But what they did do, they put his daughter up, her daughter up, to interview me. The first question was, Mr. Scargill, what's it like to be the most hated person in Britain? I said, I haven't a clue. My name's not Thatcher. I want to salute you in the name of the greatest trade union leaders I ever knew. Only by reading that people like Jim, like the leader in Ireland, and of course it was Larkin. But of course they took action when all the movement were opposing them. They were right to fight in 1913, and we gave them support all we could, or our forefathers did. And they reciprocated that in 1984 and 1985, when all our young people, young men and young women, took to the streets with us. All I can say is, I salute you. I was proud to be one of you. I'll never forget you. I was a socialist from the age of 16. And I'll be a socialist till the day I die.